have to remember, Roger did such a good job earlier, that now that I work full-time for RFE, I have to say at the beginning that my opinions are my own and don't reflect those of my employer. So I want to talk briefly at the start of the presentation today about myths that continue to persist about the Central Asian jihadist movement and sort of why, before we get into the directions for where we are and possibly where we're going. This picture comes from a Russian media report originally at some point a couple of years ago, but it really could have come, it could have been published at any time from, say, the 1980s up until today. The picture of Islamist militancy or jihadism in Central Asia and its, or its role even in terms of the Soviet Union still continues to be this same idea, that it's primarily based in Afghanistan, that it's sitting just on the borders of Central Asia and ready to cross that border anytime. I remember I told a story about to a class yesterday at the Foreign Service Institute about going in 2015 in the summer to the Countering Violent Extremism Conference in Astana, and I went all the way from Florida to Astana and was informed the night before that my talk had been scratched. And in my place was someone from the SCO who told everyone that there were 4,000 ISIS troops sitting on the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and they were ready to attack at any moment. So it was basically exactly the opposite of everything that I was going to say. But this is the same kind of, even though they've gone away from that rhetoric a little bit, this is the same kind of thing that we continue to hear over and over again. The image of the jihadist movement based in or drawing from Central Asians. And the reality is that, especially following Syria, it's not as if the Central Asian jihadist movement or Central Asian participation in the global Salafi jihadist movement is dead in some way. In fact, it's more alive and well now than it has been in many years. But it continues to be understood by a lot of people in sort of the general public and policy circles and the media in particular, as if it continues to be a showdown between these two men. For some of you, this picture will be very familiar. These are screenshots from the home video that was taken in Namangan and the famous standoff between Toher Yildosh and Islam Karimov, when Yildosh stood up and talked and Karimov had to sit down. And this is generally understood, misunderstood, but that's for another day, to be the genesis of the militant Islamist movement in Central Asia, and that it continues to be, in the popular understanding, still a sort of showdown between these two men. But the problem with that, of course, is that both of them are dead. And so in this general understanding that this was a great showdown between Islam Karimov and the government of Uzbekistan and these Islamist movements, we would expect when Islam Karimov died, finally, in August or September, depending on who you believe, of last year, or how you define death in this case, when Karimov finally died officially on the 2nd of September, you would have expected, given this general myth or this general understanding, that this would be the most important thing to most of these, particularly Uzbek or Uzbek language jihadist groups. But in reality, their headline covering the event was simply Islam Karimov has died. And I should clarify this by saying out of the 4 or 5 different Uzbek language media outlets for distinct extremist groupings, this is the only one I could find that published an article at all. So Islam Karimov has died. During the period of his presidency, Karimov led a pitched battle against Islam and Islamic leaders. As a result of this struggle, not only in Uzbekistan, but perhaps in the territory of the whole Central Asia, the Central Asian region, Islam was plunged into a state of paralysis. This is more sort of a historical note on something that happened. And the next day, when we go back to look at this is Tawhid Vajihor. This is a sort of Al-Qaeda affiliate grouping, an Uzbek battalion inside what was the Jabhat al-Nusra front. Then in Aleppo, by the next day, the story had fallen down all the way to the bottom of the page. And by the end of the week, you had to search for it on the site to find it anymore. So this is where we come back to this reality that this period of the Central Asian Jihadist movement is over now. It's bookended. The death of Tohir Yoldosh was already almost 8 years ago now, and Islam Karimov has died as well. And so we're going to have to come up with some sort of new understanding of what this movement is like, because it clearly doesn't understand itself anymore to be a symbolic or mythical standoff between these two men. In the other coverage, the largest Uzbek militant group, the Al-Bukhari Brigade, had a pre-prepared piece that was simply questioning whether or not independence under Karimov was really independence or whether it was slavery, making reference to cotton picking and forced labor. No reference at all to Karimov's death. He actually died and didn't even get an obituary from this group. In the only video that I was able to find addressing the group, this again comes from the Tawhid Jihad Brigade, so Uzbeks affiliated with Al-Qaeda in Syria, at least at that time. Theoretically, the group has separated itself from Al-Qaeda and declared a kind of independence now, but that's a little bit questionable. But this video is about 12 seconds long, and someone asked them off camera, how do you want to comment on the death of Karimov? Do you have a message? The lead title is a message from the Mujahideen in Syria to our grieving brothers and sisters in Uzbekistan. And the guy on the left says, my message is, you'll be led by another old man. And the other one laughs and says, yeah, and they'll send you to pick cotton. And that's the end of the video. So this was a non-event for them. As far as they were concerned, this is an internal matter for Uzbekistan. It's something that doesn't change the way they see themselves or their own mission. So the question is then, if we have these fairly well organized and well armed and fairly well funded militant groups with Uzbeks and other Central Asians fighting in Syria, how exactly do they see their mission if it's not inside Central Asia anymore? And then where might they go after Syria? So one of their main focuses throughout the fall of last year was shifted to Russia. A great deal of the content in their media was about Russia. The biggest thing that could happen is if you shoot down a Russian helicopter or somehow take something that could be construed as a victory against Russians as they were advancing to Aleppo. This is the primary focus of at least their propaganda activity. The other thing that we see generally is that they've adapted much of their attention to focus on whatever the rest of the global Salafi jihadist movement is doing, and so they've immersed themselves pretty thoroughly into the same sort of rhetoric that you would see coming from the other groups in Syria. So a lot of the content is devoted to sort of news from the Islamic world from a jihadist perspective. So very frequently, actually I would say about as frequently as they talk about things inside Central Asia, they talk about Burma and oppression of Muslims in Burma. This is a real clear indication to me that at least in terms of the official media and the video addresses and social media that they produce, they want to convey the message that they are part and parcel of a globalist movement, not focused on the Central Asian region, not focused on some sort of vengeance against Karimov or local politics at all. They want to sell the idea to potential recruits, you come and become part of us, You'll speak the Uzbek language and you'll be around brothers and sisters from your homeland, but you will be part of a much bigger global movement that's far bigger than our own politics. From the fall, though, of last year, we started to see, but really began to see very serious setbacks for the groups both in Iraq and Syria. They kind of had one of the great stories of the Central Asian Jihadist movement over the past few years, when I've talked at this forum, has generally been to try to convince people that attention has moved from Afghanistan and Pakistan wholly into Syria, and that this had become the main focus of their activity and of this conflict. But in Syria and in Iraq, we've seen really serious setbacks. Aleppo, the advance of the Kurds and Iraqi forces, another coalition in Iraq, and then the advance of Russia and Syrian forces in Aleppo have dealt really serious setbacks to the groups, most of which were based in Aleppo. And this was Aleppo as of November or December. The last time I prepared a version of this presentation, it was, I think, the day that Aleppo finally fell. So they just aren't there anymore. And for a period of a few weeks or a couple of months, they weren't there online anymore either. So their recruiting has taken a serious setback as well. For most of these groups, when you try to open their websites for a primary form of communication for them, they're just not there. Videos have been taken down from YouTube. There was a short period of a month or 2 months when it looked like the groups might be gone completely. So where do they go from here? How do they recover from, say, January of this year and onward? What does the future look like after Syria, if there is a future for them? So the first one, primarily related to ISIS, which is heavily Tajik in Central Asia, but Uzbeks as well. We'll say lone wolves, soft targets, and conflicted states. So a first example of this that we saw last year was the Istanbul airport attack. Moving outside of Syria, we had actually a very complex, well-planned attack carried out by people who had specific militant training. And in order to conduct an attack like that, you have to have a certain amount of infrastructure present in the country already. You have to have weapons, you have to have access to resources, you have to have these things. So it's really unlikely that we would see an attack like this, say, suddenly planned in Kyrgyzstan or in Tashkent or in Kazakhstan. They just don't have the resources present on the ground to do things like that. But in Turkey, they do and have for many years. And so it's likely that we'll continue to see attacks on soft targets like this in Turkey in particular. The second version of that, of course, was the January 1st Reyna nightclub attack in Istanbul that turned out to be carried out by an Uzbek originally from Uzbekistan. This is probably the most frightening of the potential future scenarios, where we have someone who chose a very soft target. And this is the sort of attack that doesn't need any particular background or training. You just have to have access to one weapon and to a soft target. And this is where we're likely to see probably many of the future attacks. In Turkey, my guess is that Turkey will continue to be a focus for a lot of these things. Turkey continues to have an infrastructure that other areas simply don't have. So in Turkey, for example, we still have an Uzbek language Salafist madrasa that looks to be probably facilitating people into militant conflict as well. And then the Al-Bukhari Brigade has announced, just before the siege of Aleppo began in earnest, they announced that they were moving back to Afghanistan. And just this last month, they reappeared running operations inside Afghanistan. We have no idea at this point what their numbers are there or what their capabilities are, but it's not unusual in a post-conflict situation like this, where in the past these militant Salafi jihadist movements hit a stumbling block. They tend to search out other areas, other conflicts, because conflicted states are places where they can operate permissibly. So the second one, it may be sort of more concerning to me, is what we call the commercialization or mainstreaming of militant conflict. And this is one of the things that they've adapted in order to get around new obstacles in communication. So this, for example, is a page focusing on the Tawhid ba Jihad movement, so Uzbeks who used to be part of Al-Qaeda. But they no longer brand their material, the material that remains, as part of even part of this militant group. Instead, it's sold actually as a video blog for this one specific young guy who goes around. He's produced a dozen or 2 dozen of these really actually good quality, very well produced videos where he runs around giving what he calls a close-up view of the life of the Syrian warriors, and this draws a fairly large audience. You pull people in who don't necessarily agree with the ideology of any specific group, but young men who are interested in seeing what it's like to live inside a war firsthand. And these groups also tend to offer, without any ideology again, or having to sign up to support of a specific group, they tend to offer online tutorials for how to use specific weapons, how to conduct specific types of attacks that would potentially enable or empower lone wolf attacks inside Central Asia or in other places. Again, they pull away from openly identifying themselves with one group. This is one of their main social media profiles on Facebook. It's just called Good News from Syria. And you wouldn't know when this person tries to friend you on Facebook right away exactly where they are, where they're coming from. You wouldn't know that they're an official spokesman for an Al-Qaeda affiliated group, but that's how they run. And then second of all, they tend to mask themselves. This is an old tactic that was invented probably by the IJU in the Uzbek language back already 10 or 15 years ago. They sort of mask themselves under popular Uzbek imams with a good reputation for solid theology and good devotional teaching, and then once they pull people into groups like that, then they insert their own ideology. The next one, we see another interesting example of a group that has sort of forsaken all ideological affiliation. This group, Malhama Tactical, was profiled a couple of weeks ago in a pretty good article in Foreign Policy. They were billed by the foreign policy authors as possibly the first jihadist private military contractor group. I would tend to differ a little bit with that. I think jihadist private military contracting is not a new thing. It's been around since Pakistan, certainly in the 1980s, and especially in the 1990s. There's a good scholar I like, Joshua White, who's done work on the tribal areas in Pakistan, who called what developed there in the early 1990s jihad as vocation, or jihad as an enterprise, as an entrepreneurship. And this is something that we see starting to develop in following Syria as the larger, more organized groups sort of fall apart. We see more of this kind of thing. So this young Uzbek guy, Abu Rafiq, he calls himself, offers private military lessons and private military services to anyone who's willing to pay for them inside Syria. Not for the Syrian government forces, but he rents himself out as a trainer and as a tactical instructor, both in person for a fee and then posts all of these videos online, and has developed kind of a cult personality, a cult following for himself that glorifies violence in the absence really of any specific ideology. And so it tends, I think, to spread the parameters of the audience that would otherwise be receptive to this kind of thing. This is an example of one of the instructional videos that they give on, the instructional videos are mostly done in Russian. There's a large audience for this, on how to do indoor warfare, how to enter a structure and clear it, in the same way that you'd see military training more formal. And then, as a great example in closing of how sort of this has blended with pop culture. There was a rumor a couple of weeks ago that Abu Rafiq had been killed, and he's reached such a sort of celebrity status across languages that we even saw sad pandas put up on social media to mourn his passing that turned out to be a bit premature. So jihadists, sad pandas, private contracting, very little ideology in these things, but a kind of culture of violence. And one of the ways that we see, in closing, a final example for this, is that we see people attracted to this sort of culture of violence, free of any ideology, into multiple groups. We have an example, a really interesting example of an Uzbek villager from Tajikistan who was interviewed by an RFERL journalist, Shahir Tulaganova, last year, who ended up fighting for the pro-Russian separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, and who said that everyone else, all the other guys in his village, went to join ISIS in Syria, and that's what he wanted to do too, but he didn't have a foreign passport. He only had a domestic passport, so he could only join a militant group within the Soviet Union, within the former Soviet Union. And so he decided to go and fight to restore the Soviet Union inside the Donbass rather than join ISIS. So we focus a lot on ideology, but especially as we see this become more popular and mainstreamed, I think we may see more cases like this. So thank you.